It's time for a contest of the slow, bolter-spewing, walking death machines. In this video we'll be comparing Aggressors and Assault Centurions. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Since the newer Space Marine Codex and all the supplement books have come out, both Aggressors and Assault Centurions have been seeing a lot of play recently, and both of these guys fill a very similar role in the army, being very tough multi-wound infantry that can spew an absolute ton of bolt shots at the enemy before getting into close combat to take them out with power fists. In this video we'll be taking a look at their relative merits. We'll be comparing their shooting in terms of raw damage output, their melee potential, their durability versus a range of weapons, and finally we'll look at any other factors that I don't think that the maths highlights quite as well. In this review we'll be comparing the loadouts that I think are strongest at the moment. The Assault Centurions will be packing those mighty Hurricane Bolters and Flamers, and the Aggressors will be blazing away with their Boltstorm Gauntlets and Fragstorm Grenade Launchers. In the first few mathsy type reviews, we'll be having a unit of 4 Aggressors face off against a unit of 3 Assault Centurions. The Assault Centurions are 5 points more expensive, so do bear that in mind, but I thought it would be more helpful to see the actual damage outputs of real squads that you could have on the table. So without further ado, let's get into it then. Let's see what they can do in the shooting gallery first. So here's our first table then, showing the damage output of 4 Aggressors and 3 Assault Centurions, firing in tactical doctrine against a squad that is at 18-inch range. This means that the Centurions are not able to use their Flamers, and we're assuming the Aggressors haven't been able to double fire this turn, as they had to move to get in range. As all of the guns on both of these guys have the exact same profile, they will generally do the same against every target, and the Aggressors beat out the Centurions by a very small amount on each target, but honestly it's so little point for point that it doesn't really make too much difference. For example, the Aggressors will kill 14 Guardsmen and the Assault Centurions 13.5, although both put around 4 wounds on a vehicle with toughness 7. The only big difference is if we ever look at a unit that's in cover, such as our Tactical Space Marine with a cover save, where the Centurions' Omniscopes heftily beat out the Aggressors, as ignoring cover makes a really big difference, particularly on high saving throw models such as other Space Marines. Despite being very low in the numbers here, I'd honestly say that this one is a slight win for the Assault Centurions, as against almost every target, the damage output is almost exactly the same, but whenever anyone gets a cover save, the Centurions heftily win, and cover saves aren't uncommon throughout 40k. Let's take a look at their special firing modes now. So this one shows if the Centurions happen to be in range to use their Flamers by any reason, and if the Aggressors are able to double shoot, either because they've remained stationary, or because they've been able to use one of the chapter-specific abilities to get them to shoot as if they counted as if they were stationary. Again, it's a fairly similar story, except the gap has widened very slightly, as double shooting is slightly better than having the Flamers in range. They're still fairly similar in terms of damage output, but now it's getting to the stage where you might actually slightly notice the difference. For example, the Centurions only kill 11 Tactical Marines, whereas the Aggressors kill over 12. Again, though, the Omniscopes of the Assault Centurions will mean that they should win out usually when the model has a cover save. The only thing to note about this is that the difficulty of getting both of these conditions met isn't necessarily equal. For standard units that are just walking up the board and aren't using any deep strike tricks such as with Raven Guard successors, I think it will be easier to get the Aggressors to double fire than it will be to get the Assault Centurions in Flamer range. As for the latter you have to be within 8-inch range, and for the former you need to just stand still within 18-inch range, and I think that standing still within 18 inches is generally going to come up more. Obviously this does depend on the actual battlefield situation you're in, but that's just my 2 cents. Overall, I'd conclude that the Aggressors win the shooting game, but only very marginally, and only if the target doesn't have cover. Let's look at their melee damage output now. This next chart shows the very simple and brutal efficiency with which both of these units pile damage onto various units. I think the first takeaway is that both of these will do an enormous amount of damage to any unit that they get in combat with, but on the whole it is going to be the Assault Centurions that will do better against hard targets. Against Guardsmen, the difference is very small indeed. In fact, it's so small that the Aggressors are actually very slightly more efficient point for point, as their squad is slightly cheaper, but honestly it's so close that it's not really worth splitting hairs over. The real difference comes when we start to look at harder targets. The Assault Centurions win very slightly on the Tactical Marines, killing 7.2 compared with the Aggressors' 5.9, the high AP of those siege drills coming into play. They heftily beat them out against the intercessors, causing 14.4 wounds versus 8.9. This one due to the fact that you know every time that a siege drill attack goes through, an intercessor dies, where the D3 for the Aggressors' Boltstorm Gauntlets won't necessarily kill one. Against the Aggressors, the maths gets a bit more complicated, but the fact that the Boltstorm Gauntlets are only strength 8, the high AP of the siege drills, and the chance of the Boltstorm Gauntlets to massively overkill or underkill the Aggressors means that Centurions are a lot better at killing Aggressors. Finally, if we look at a typical multi-wound vehicle, the Assault Centurion siege drills again win out absolutely massively, doing almost double the amount of damage as the Aggressor squad will. I think the takeaway from this one is that Assault Centurions just have hands down better melee, and they can get up to really scary levels of damage dealing, even with a squad of just 3 of them. Just as an aside, I did all these calculations assuming that we weren't in Assault Doctrine, but assuming that we were using Shock Assault after both squads had charged in. Now we come to the question of durability. This table shows how many shots it will take for various weapons to down our 2 different units. Against small arms and standard anti-infantry firepower, the Assault Centurions are significantly more durable. In particular, against lasguns, they're going to be twice as durable, due to their 2-up save mean that they only fail half as many armor saves as the Aggressors. Of course, both units have the same number of wounds, with 12 apiece. The Assault Centurions also take a lot more bolt rifle shots and heavy bolter shots to take down compared with the Aggressors, again due to their high armor. Against damage 2 weapons, things get a lot more interesting though. This is because damage 2 weapons are very good at killing 4 wound Assault Centurions, but less good at killing 3 wound Aggressors, just because you're going to need 2 hits to kill both of them, and they don't care at all whether you have 4 wounds or 3 wounds. In the case of Imperial Knight Avenger Gatling cannons, with strength 6, AP-2 and damage 2, this effect actually cancels out the armor advantage the Centurions have, meaning that it'll take 18 successful Avenger Gatling cannon hits to wipe both units. If we look at overcharged plasma, then the balance actually swings in favour of the Aggressors, not massively, but they will need just one more plasma hit to bring them down than the Assault Centurions, with 14.5 to 13.5. On the other hand though, if they're being hit by flat damage 3 weapons, such as the Las Fusel, the Centurions go massively out in the lead again, as it'll take 2 shots to down each Centurion, but only 1 to kill each Aggressor. Finally, the maths for D6 damage shots when they're targeting 3 wound and 4 wound models is complicated. In a complete vacuum, damage D6 weapons are actually slightly better at killing 4 wound models than 3 wound models, but the difference isn't so great that it outweighs the advantage provided by the Assault Centurion's armour. So they're very slightly tougher against las cannons and things, but it's only a very small difference. They basically have roughly the same durability against las cannons. Overall, I'd put this down as a win for the Assault Centurions, as particularly against small arms fire and flat damage 3 weapons they're far more durable, though against damage D6 weapons and things like overcharged plasma it's pretty much even. Now then, let's sum it all up and have a look at all of the other external factors that you'd want to consider when making a choice between these 2 units, and there are really quite a lot of positives and negatives on both sides. Starting with the Aggressors, from the maths we've shown that they have stronger firepower if there's no cover, though not by much. They have their very powerful option to double fire, and if you can make that happen fairly reliably, they will outperform the Centurions, particularly if the Assault Centurions can't get in flamer range. Their 5-inch movement is 1 inch better than the Assault Centurions, and that will add up to better positioning throughout the game, and they will actually likely be far more mobile than the Centurions are, due to being able to advance and shoot with no penalty, though obviously they can't double fire. The advance and shoot really can't be underestimated. It means that with their standard damage output, they'll be moving on average 8.5 inches per turn, getting them right up towards the enemy, maybe allowing for more charges, or perhaps double firing options the turn after, provided they survive. In terms of durability, they lose out in most cases, but they do certainly have a niche where they're tougher against overcharged plasma, which is quite common in the meta. Beyond the maths that we've just done, Aggressors also have the Primaris keyword, which can be helpful for certain things, such as allowing them to use some stratagems like Gene-Wrought Might, which is actually a fairly significant close combat buff. Though we've talked about the Boltstorm variant, you do have the option to run them with Flamestorm Gauntlets. Might be something to consider a bit more if you have better synergy with flame weapons, such as those Salamanders. Aggressors also have some synergies with certain Space Marine chapters that might make you want to pick them up over the Assault Sense. In particular, Imperial Fists ignoring cover will essentially give you the Omniscope advantage on these guys, and the Assault Sense don't get anything out of it, as they already have the Omniscope to ignore cover. The other main chapter specific advantage for Aggressors is the advantage where they can move and counter stationary and still double tap their weapons, meaning that massively higher shooting damage output is going to be a load easier to achieve. At the moment, Ultramarines can do this via the Signs of Guilliman doctrine, Salamanders can do this with a Stratagem, and Dark Angels can do it with a Chaplain Litany. All of these guys can have an Aggressor squad trot up 5 inches and then still unleash their enormous bolter payloads, double firing at 18 inches or even 21 inches in case of the Dark Angels. Finally, outside of pure rules matters, most people do tend to prefer the looks of the Aggressors over the Assault Centurions, and I have to say that I am one of them. So that might be a deciding factor on which one you want to pick up if it's a close call. Also, Aggressors have the advantage of being slightly cheaper point for point than the Assault Centurions, not by much, but they are quite a lot cheaper model per model, though obviously their models are a tiny bit smaller than the Assault Centurions. So that's Aggressors then. Let's take a look at the advantage of the Assault Cents. First of all, they have a greater threat range with their bolters. Basically, the 4-inch movement plus 24 inches of the Hurricane bolter gives them a threat range of 28 inches. The Aggressors advance and then shoot 18 inches will typically give them a threat range of 26.5 inches, so a little bit smaller. The longer range of the Hurricane bolter is also a factor in itself, in and above that, because say if you wanted your unit to sit back and stay in cover for a turn, then being able to reach out and touch units 24 inches away is very powerful compared with the Aggressors being limited to only 18-inch range, which could really restrict the targets. Where the Aggressors have their double shoot ability, the Assault Centurions have their Flamers to provide some extra strength for hits. These will often not always be in range if you do start them walking up the board, but there are some situations where they can be key, particularly in Raven Guard Successor's Deep Strike with long-range marksmen to automatically get those Flamers in range, and also those Flamers will be ridiculously nasty to charge in Overwatch for any enemy infantry trying to charge you up close. We've already talked about their Omniscope, but in terms of the shooting game, this is a very significant advantage. There are quite a lot of armies that have cover saves baked into them, or have a lot of small elite units that can easily hug cover, and being able to punch straight through, say, an Eldar Ranger's +2 to their cover save is very satisfying indeed. The Assault Centurions have pretty much hands down better melee, and markedly so against big targets. The Aggressors aren't bad by any stretch of the imagination, but the Assault Cents are just better. They also are generally a fair bit tougher, as we've seen from the Math Hammer, in almost all scenarios barring overcharged plasma, and even then it's quite close. Something that we didn't mention earlier though is that the Assault Centurions will make better use of cover than the Aggressors will. That's because having +1 to your cover save when you're already on a 2-up is going to make you incredibly resistant even against high AP weapons. For example, a Centurion in cover will still be saving on a 4-up even against an AP 3 weapon, which is far better than saving on a 5-up that the Aggressor would be in the same scenario. Though you can fill the same amount in each squad, the Assault Centurions kind of get a bigger unit with more wounds on the table and a lot more points investment. This means that they're a fair bit better placed to make better use of stratagems, anything that buffs the damage output or survivability, things like transhuman physiology, Imperial Fist bolter drill, Salamanders +1 to wounds for Crucible of Battle. Anything that can affect one squad will generally go further on a maxed out squad of Centurions compared with a maxed out squad of Aggressors, just because the unit costs so much more. Again, the Centurions do have some other options. I do think that the Hurricane Bolters and the Flamers are the best take-all-comers option, but you could have a strategy that involves around their melter guns, particularly if you were Salamanders for example, or you could keep them very cheap indeed and just use assault launchers and focus on getting the most out of their considerable melee ability. Though for me, I think that the extra 10 points is a very good deal for the horrendous amount of bolter fire that they can unleash. In terms of chapter-specific options, Imperial Fist Siegebreaker cohorts to get mortal wounds on vehicles is an incredibly solid option for Centurions, and will put their damage output and shooting absolutely through the roof against hard targets. The other major competitive use for Assault Centurions are Raven Guard or White Scars. Assault Centurions deep striking right next to the enemy to get them close for a horrendous amount of flamer and bolter shots, followed up by a devastating charge. Of course, the Aggressors can do exactly the same thing, but this does have the advantage for the Assault Centurions, because if you play them as a successor chapter with long-range marksmen, you can allow them to get their Flamers in range on the turn that they drop, meaning that they will have higher firepower on that turn than the Aggressors will, as the Aggressors won't be able to double shoot, but the Assault Centurions will be able to use their Flamers. So overall, who wins in this comparison then? For me, I think that the units are fairly well balanced. In terms of raw might, I think it will typically be the Assault Centurions that win, as their shooting is maybe a little worse than the Aggressors, but their melee and durability is significantly better. On the whole, at the moment, I think that the Assault Centurions are a slight bit more competitive than the Aggressors units, but they both absolutely can have their roles in different armies. In particular, if you're running the ones that can move and double tap those Aggressors, particularly Ultramarines that could do it for an entire army's worth of Aggressors turn 2 if they wanted, then the Aggressors could easily beat out the Assault Centurions. Typically, in a pure competitive list, I would probably run Assault Centurions myself, outside of one of those specific chapters. I think that the chapter that you're using them in is the single biggest determinant for whether you choose one over the other. However, if you're not using the Ultramarine Salamanders or Dark Angels to move and double shoot them, I still really wouldn't stress. The two units are pretty well balanced. You're not going to gain a lot of extra battlefield utility from bothering to switch to Assault Centurions. The two units generally have a lot of pros and cons between the two of them, and I think that both of them are perfectly valid competitive units for Space Marines. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below then. Which do you prefer from a rules perspective? And if that's Centurions, then is the cost and the look of the models something that you could stomach to make you take them over Aggressors? I have a feeling that for a lot of people that might well be a no. Thanks for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. If you'd like to see more content like this, then feel free to subscribe to the channel. We've got new Warhammer 40k Tactics content coming out every day. I do have a Patreon page, as making these videos takes quite a lot of time, so any support you'd be willing to give to the channel will be absolutely greatly appreciated, and a big thank you to all of the Patreons who are currently subscribed. The channel wouldn't be where it is today without you guys. So thanks again for listening, and I'll hope to see you all next time.